Good morning and welcome everyone to our next upcoming version of the Cybiant webinar series. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to all of you about the importance of setting up a cybersecurity framework. And in today's session, I'm going to give you an overview of what are common methodologies of setting up a cybersecurity framework. And we're going to look explicitly at the NIST cybersecurity framework. So I'll provide you with a bit of an outline of how cybersecurity frameworks need to be set up. We're going to look at some actual practical guidance on how to implement that. And we're going to look at some of the key cybersecurity features that you would need in order to take the next steps. So I really look forward to sharing the information with you today. Before we get started, however, today, a couple of key logistical elements. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. So at the end, if you miss anything, you can always watch it back. Towards the end of the session, we will share the video with everyone online. So you can expect an email from our site with the recording link. Additionally, if you would like to ask any questions, please use the chat functionality to do so. I will moderate all of the different questions towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions during any part, please feel free to ask for some of the questions in the chat box so I can moderate them towards the end. Last but not least, you will get a short survey at the end of this webinar so that you can provide your feedback, what you've thought about the different topics, and more importantly, what other topics you would like to see discussed in any of our upcoming sessions. So please feel free to share all of your comments and any suggestions that you might have for any of the upcoming other sessions. Good, a brief introduction about myself. My name is Jan Willem Middelburg and I'm the Managing Director of Cybiant. I have a long history in IT frameworks and the design of courses related to IT education. On the left, you see my contact details. So if you want to reach out to me after this session, please feel free to do so. I'm frequently teaching different courses on IT-related subjects. And I'm also frequently writing articles for different books or publications. So this is a bit of an introduction about myself. I would look forward to connecting with you after the session today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask or reach out to me on email. So what are we going to talk about today? For today's agenda, I've compared a number of key topics that are all related to the setup of cybersecurity frameworks. So we'll start today's session with reviewing the need for a cybersecurity framework and why many organizations today are starting to set one up within their enterprise IT. We will then have a look at what are some of the best practice guidances that are there around the world and different frameworks that have been set up in different parts of the world in the last couple of years. We will then look at how all of those different frameworks combine together in the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is nowadays one of the leading standards around the world in order to set up a good cybersecurity framework. We're going to look at some of the core aspects of this framework, some successful case studies, and what are the different steps that you can take in order to embed the NIST cybersecurity framework within your own organization. We will end this session today with looking at the different steps that you can take to set up a cybersecurity framework in your own organization. And I promise you that setting these first couple of steps is relatively straightforward and easy. So I highly encourage you to do so. At the end of the session, we will do an interactive Q&A. So if you have any questions, again, please feel free to put them into the chat and I will be able to moderate them at the end of the session. So that's a bit of the topic and the agenda for today. So let's get started with looking at some of the first key content. Setting up cybersecurity is closely related to setting up automation in an organization because we would like to set up strategies that will make threat detection automatically through a variety of different things, through artificial intelligence, robotics, and machine learning. And that is kind of the way that the organizations are progressing towards the future. And as Cybiant, we truly believe that this is an area that you should look into towards the future. Good. Why is cybersecurity so incredibly important? Well, I always like to start any talk about cyber attacks up with this small little cartoon. A lot of companies are used to securing what we know as the things that they can see. They're used to securing access, they're used to securing entry. However, there's a lot of threats nowadays which are coming over the internet. And cyber attacks are not always that visible for organizations. It's not like criminals are actually trying to get into your premises on an individual basis, but more likely they're trying to connect with you through networks or through backdoors within your different systems. And because of this invisibility factor, cybersecurity and cyber attacks are little known elements for most people, especially in large organizations. So in this webinar, I'm going to try to convey to you what that means from a setup point of view and what the different aspects are that you would need to take into account in order to get started with that. Let's start with looking at the impact of cybersecurity attacks. And I always think that this graph kind of opens a lot of people's eyes when we're talking about the impact and effect of the damages of cybersecurity problems if we showcase them in terms of US dollars. So here on this graph, you see the amount of monetary damage caused by reported cyber crimes from 2001 to 2019. And this is a pretty reliable source from the FBI and US Department of Justice. So this has been thoroughly researched. As you can see in the graph, the amount of monetary damage that is caused by cybercrime is increasing very rapidly year over year. And take into account that we're talking about millions of dollars here. So this $3.5 billion that is reported lost in 2019. Obviously, the figures for 2020 are not out yet, but I can kind of predict that it will be even more than what we see in this graph. So the damage and the threats of cybersecurity are really, really real. And yet so few organizations have actually started with implementing measures in order to deal with that. And that is exactly where the cybersecurity framework comes in. We need to set up a structure which is measurable, quantifiable, and can be managed on a day-to-day basis in order to deal with cybersecurity. So how do we do that and how do we set that up is something that we're going to look up on in the next few slides. One of my favorite graphs that I also always like to show in any kind of talk about cybersecurity is this interactive map. Of course, I've just taken a screenshot to showcase in this webinar, but if you Google online for real-time cyber attacks, you can find a very interactive map like this, which measures and tracks real-time cybersecurity attacks that are happening across the globe every single minute. So this will showcase you that the amount of cyber attacks is actually quite staggering, and it happens every single day. This is a great visualization tool in case you need to convey the message how serious cybercrime and cyber attacks are on a day-to-day basis. And it also significantly explains why the damages that I showed on the previous slide have been increasing year over year. It is my personal opinion that cyber attacks will be the cause of the major disruptions of both governments and companies and governments towards the future. And it all starts with making sure that you adequately prepare for these kinds of attacks. And in the cybersecurity framework, we're going to talk about how to actually do that. So let's have a look at what has been developed over the years. There are a number of different ways and approaches in which most organizations, and especially larger ones, have been dealing with cybersecurity for the last couple of years. The three main standards that have been in operation for quite a long time are the COBAT controls, the Council of Cybersecurity Critical Security Controls, and the ISO 27001 standard for information security management. All of these different documents are now considered best practice frameworks, and most organizations have started to implement aspects of all of these different frameworks or elements of them. COBIT is primarily used for controls and objectives and has a strong background in accounting and auditing. The Council of Cybersecurity is more related from a technical point of view and recommends approaches and best practices in order to control security in your organization. And the ISO 27001 has been a global standard across the world, which puts into place more of a management of information security. So although all of these three are very, very good frameworks in its independently, and they all complement each other in different ways, what is, in my view, really important is that they are more woven into each other. And this is where the NIST Cybersecurity Framework comes in. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is this overarching framework which has been set up by the US government and combines all of these other frameworks together. And when I'm saying combining, it is not saying that it is going to incorporate them, and it's not a standalone framework. So what NIST does very well is that it makes reference to other best practices in order to explain how you can solve different aspects of cybersecurity. And I think this is one of the key reasons why the framework has been growing so rapidly. So I think you should know a little bit more about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, how it's being set up, and what are the benefits of using this framework. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the second part of the webinar. Let's have a quick look at the origin of the cybersecurity framework. The reason that I'm showing you this slide is to make you aware that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is actually quite a new development. The executive order, which commanded the development of the cybersecurity framework, only dates back to 2013, meaning that the moment that the framework was ordered to be developed was just 7 years ago. The framework actually launched in 2014 and has been going through a number of different revisions ever since. But this showcases to you that this is really a more newer development. It's not been around for decades. So the cybersecurity framework was initiated from a US executive order point of view. And it stated at that time that it's the policy of the United States to enhance the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure and to maintain a cyber environment that encourages efficiency, innovation, and economic prosperity while promoting safety, security, business confidentiality, privacy, and civil liberties. So that's quite a strong statement, and it encompasses a lot of different aspects that need to be covered within the framework. And that is exactly how the government went to work in order to set up this cybersecurity framework. So in 2013, the executive order was signed. In 2014, there was the Security Enhancement Act. And in 2017, there was the executive order to further strengthen cybersecurity of the federal networks and critical infrastructure. So we've seen that the NIST cybersecurity framework has a clear origin in the United States, but it has gradually grown to become a global standard in a lot of different countries. So towards the end of this webinar, I'll showcase you some successful case studies, which are not only based in the United States, but are happening all across the world. We're also going to look at some of the other countries that have already embraced the NIST cybersecurity framework as a global standard. And once again, I think the reason why the framework is so successful is that it's not trying to replace any existing standards that organizations already have in place, but it rather combines them and provides references towards all of these other materials. So this is the reason why this standard has been growing. So it's always good, I think, to place these things into their historical perspective so you can kind of understand where it all comes from. So let's have a closer look at then what is the framework itself. If we look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, we see that it is composed of 3 core components, or key components, I should say. The first component is considered the core component, and that is going to be applicable for every organization, no matter whether you're a government or commercial enterprise. The core aspects of the cybersecurity framework describe the desired cybersecurity outcomes, which are organized in a hierarchy and aligned to more detailed guidance and controls. So basically, this core aspect answers the question, how does an organization need to deal with cybersecurity? What are the goals in order to set it up? And what will be the relevant outcomes for setting up this framework in its entirety? The second part of the framework is about profiles. And the profiles are an alignment of the organization's requirements towards their objective, risk appetite, and resources, which have been described in the previous framework core. So this is where we start to implement the measures, the different controls, as well as the technology to make sure that we are able to achieve the goals that we've set up in the core framework. So this is where the cybersecurity framework becomes more practical. This is where we're going to design our firewalls, set up physical security, and look at things like application security and different aspects from a technology point of view. The last part of the framework consists of implementation tiers, which are a qualitative measure of organizational cybersecurity risk management practices. I will cover some more information about the implementation tiers a little bit later in this webinar, but please note that this is the third core component of the cybersecurity framework. So this is the way that the framework is structured. Now let's have a look at how the different content elements have been specified from a framework point of view. And on this next slide, I always think is one of the core aspects of the framework itself. In this next slide, you see the principles of the current and future versions of the framework. First of all, please note that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was developed to be be applicable for long-term use, meaning that it needs to provide common and accessible language that can be understood by every organization, every government, and that is clear across the world. Additionally, the framework aims to have an adaptation of many technologies, meaning that it's vendor independent. It's not recommending any particular technology, but it looks at it from a framework point of view. And this is the reason why I'm such a big fan of frameworks. It is a general best practice, general guidance, and no matter how small, big, or in which industry your organization is operating, you can find vendor neutral solutions in order to set up something which you can use for many, many years. The third key aspect of the framework is that it's risk-based. So what we're trying to do in cybersecurity is look at the different cybersecurity threats, look at what the risk that they pose for the organization, and how we should then take different measures in order to control them. And this, of course, is going to be different from an organization to organization. As we've already mentioned, the whole framework is incorporated and embedded based on those international standards that we talked about earlier. Standards like the ISO 27001 are very good in their own right, and they have been embedded within the current framework. And that's really good news for organizations and governments because they might have been investing for years in getting those standards in place. So it does not mean that they need to replace anything. They're just going to use a framework to tie all of these different elements together. Last but not least, the framework was developed by a wide effort and it's guided by different perspectives from different stakeholders across the world. The cybersecurity framework has been designed not just to be the standard for government organizations, but also to be a standard for the private sector, academia, and different organizations across the world. And I think that this also contributes to the fact why the framework is so incredibly successful and why so many organizations are trying to adopt it. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can basically see the core different areas that we're going to look at in the cybersecurity framework, which range from identification of threats, the protection of the organization, the detection of any cybersecurity threats, how to respond in case a cybersecurity attack happens, and last but not least, the last segment covers the recovery steps that organizations can take. So these are the core disciplines, the core elements that the cybersecurity framework is going to talk about. And in the next couple of slides, I will showcase you some further information on how that actually works in practice. So let's have a look at that. So at the framework core, the key objective is to provide this common language and methodology across the world. So if you're a big multinational and you have offices in different countries across the world, the framework in itself remains unchanged because it describes the desired outcomes. It needs to be understandable to everyone, and it applies to any type of risk management approach. Meaning if your organization has a very high risk appetite, you could still use certain elements of the framework. If your organization needs to have very strong cybersecurity practices because you're dealing with a lot of proprietary or confidential information, you can still use the same elements of the framework in order to identify threats and take measures accordingly. So the whole framework spans the entire breadth of cybersecurity and looks at all elements, both from a prevention and a reaction point of view. And I also think that this is a really strong element of the framework. It's not just looking at how can we prevent cybersecurity attacks. It also covers how do we need to deal whenever we have a problem. And this is, from my experience, also what I've seen is lacking in a lot of organizations. A lot of time, money, and effort is making sure that is spent on preventing certain things to happen. But as soon as different cybersecurity elements do happen and a threat is materializing, there's not clear procedures in place on how do we deal with that on a day-by-day basis. So the cybersecurity framework in itself is trying to address this gap, and I think they've done a pretty successful job in doing that. So let's have a look at a little bit more detail of the cybersecurity framework. So obviously in this webinar, we just have 1 hour, so I'm not going to be able to go through all of the different aspects of the cybersecurity framework documentation in detail. The good news is that you can download this whole framework from the NIST website. It's completely free. So you can look at all of the different elements within the NIST cybersecurity framework documentation. What I will do today is give you a bit of an overview of how should you read this? How should we understand what is going on within the NIST cybersecurity guidance. So let's start with understanding some of the different elements that we want to see within the framework itself. Every section of the documentation is built up in a different functions, and we've already established on the last slide that there is 5 different functions. So if I move back 1 slide, you're going to see that we're now in the color purple are taking one of the documents that is regarded in the protect domain. So the protect domain is one of the 5 functions that we're going to need to address within the framework point of view. So within each function, there is a number of different categories, and there's a total set of 23 different cybersecurity categories within the NIST cybersecurity framework. So let's look at one example category, and this category is identity management, authentication, and access control, which has been abbreviated to PRAC. Obviously, this category is going to look at access of physical and logical assets and the associated facilities within which elements of cybersecurity importance are being housed. So every function will have a number of these categories. Within each of these categories, there are a number of subcategories, and this is really what is going to make the framework very practical. Each of the subcategories could also be considered a particular control that an organization needs to get under control and needs to manage on a day-to-day basis, or at least have periodic reviews of whether they're still complying to each of those subcategories. So if we look at, for instance, 2 different subcategories within identity management, authentication, and access control, we see here subcategories 6 and 7, which is the first one is to make sure that identities are proved and bound to credentials and asserted in interactions. Other than that, for instance, identity management subcategory number 7 is that users, devices, and other assets need to be authenticated commensurate with the risk of each individual transaction. So you see that from very high level, from the function point of view, towards each subcategory, it becomes really practical. So each of these subcategory basically asserts a number of key controls or a number of key subcategories that any organization needs to have under control. And this is something that you can measure on a daily basis. Where NIST subsequently works further, and I think that this is the strength of the framework, is that it makes reference to leading and global best practices and standards. So for instance, on the previous slides, we looked at a number of different key best practices across the world, like for instance, COVID or the ISO 27000 standards. So within the framework, a reference has been made to where you can find good measures and good approaches in order to implement this subcategory successfully. It does not mean that you need to use all of these informative references and that you need to review all of them, but typically each of these provides good guidance, best practices, which have been way longer around than the NIST cybersecurity framework. So they, standards like the ISO 27000 have been around for longer periods of time. So they provide the references on where you can find how-to implementation guidance to make sure that you manage these different subcategories, controls, etc. So within the NIST cybersecurity framework, we typically refer to 6 different references that NIST considers as leading standards across the world on how to implement cybersecurity framework in practice. So one more time, as a high-level overview, the framework itself consists of 5 functions. Within those 5 functions, there are 23 different categories, and I always refer to these as focus areas within cybersecurity. Within these 23 categories, there are 108 subcategories, which are basically the controls that you need to have in place and the things that you can measure on a daily basis. And then the 6 references make a mapping on how you can make sure that every subcategory can be taken under control and where you can find more information on how to do this in practice. So that's the very high level way that in which a cybersecurity framework is being structured. So as I mentioned before, one of the beautiful things about the cybersecurity framework is that you can measure it. And on the previous slide, we specifically say that measurement happens within each of the subcategories. So you could measure over time, you can do audits in order to ensure that you're compliant towards these different sublevels. And within the cybersecurity framework, there's typically 4 different levels of cybersecurity implementation maturity. And those are the ones that you see here on the slide. So they range from partial aspects in place towards being risk informed, having repeatable processes and measures in place, and adaptive measures, making sure that you are able to adapt them. So for each of the different subcategories, you can start to measure and monitor how well you're doing in terms of cybersecurity and risk management. And I think that that will provide the practical guidance that organizations need in order to keep this under control. You really want to make sure that at all times you have these different controls ready and that you have all of them combined from a framework point of view. So this really is a second dimension towards the NIST cybersecurity framework, is that it's not just providing you with the guidance of what to do, it also explains how you can measure that and implement that on a day-to-day basis. So that's what we're covering in this particular section. Because the framework was launched in 2013 and it has been widely adopted by different governments, different organizations across the world, we quickly saw that their framework required an update. So in 2014, already the first version of the first updates to the NIST cybersecurity framework was made, in which there was more guidance provided on the applicability of systems lifecycle phases, the enhanced guidance for managing cybersecurity within supply chains, and a number of different improvements, as we can see right here on the screen. And I think that that's really also one of the core aspects to take into account when we're talking about how do we set and work with this cybersecurity framework. It's an evolving standard. It's an evolving framework that will get better over time based on the expertise and the new technology updates that keep happening. So that's what really makes it useful. As I mentioned earlier in the webinar, although the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was started as a US initiative and it was started by an executive order from the United States itself, it quickly became an international standard. And that's also why we became involved with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We frequently saw that other countries also wanted to embrace or adopt these standards into their day-to-day usage. And this is, I think, also one of the reasons why the framework has been growing so rapidly. So on this slide, you see a couple of countries who've already embraced the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and who are actually using it on a day-to-day basis. So countries like Japan, the UK, Israel, they're all looking already at how do we use these different standards across the world. We also see that different other organizations like ISO itself, or for instance, the International Energy Board, are using these standards in order to implement cybersecurity in their own organizations. And I think that's really one of the key messages of this webinar as well. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework is available for free. It's considered a global best practice. So I hope that I encourage everyone who is on this webinar today to at least have a look at it, read up upon the different ways that you can apply the standard in daily practice, and start using some key aspects of it, because a lot of organizations have already done this, and they have very successful case studies in place on how do you embed the different aspects and the quality controls that we've just talked about. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more on which types of organizations have been doing this on a day-to-day basis, on this slide, I've listed a number of organizations across the world, ranging from universities to countries that have embedded the cybersecurity framework based on the NIST standards that we've discussed in this webinar. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I highly encourage you to visit this link, the NIST.gov cyber framework and the success stories, which showcase a number of different companies that have embraced and embedded the NIST cybersecurity framework and are using it on a day-to-day basis. So I think that that really makes it strong, because the number of case studies keeps growing and growing, and therefore more and more organizations are starting to embrace it. So these are some examples of successful case studies. Of course, every particular cybersecurity framework starts with knowledge. And I think that this is one of the crucial aspects of the framework. You cannot implement a framework if you don't know the details of the way that the standard has been composed, the way that the framework works, and what are the different components of the framework. So in partnership with APMG, and we have launched the NCSP program last year, which is basically teaching about the NIST cybersecurity and enterprise risk management. So at this moment, there are 2 different certifications available, which will showcase the different users at what level they are aware about this cybersecurity framework from NIST. So there is a foundation course, which you see over here, and there's a practitioner course for the people who actually need to implement the NIST cybersecurity framework. This training has been certified by APMG International, which is the leading certification organization out of the UK, in association with the National Cybersecurity Center, which is also a UK organization. So it's a training that is endorsed to be completely aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, and really teaches you on how do I start working with this. Obviously, in this webinar today, I've given you a sneak preview in case, or that's probably the best way to refer to it. But of course, in the actual training course, it dives into way more detail on all of those 5 different domains, and more detail about all of those different categories and subcategories. So if you're interested in that, I highly encourage you to go on one of those courses. And that's, of course, also where the interest of our company is at. So for the people who are on the webinar today, we have a special offer in case you want to participate within the NIST cybersecurity framework. We have a virtual course that is running on 2 to 3 December. It's already being confirmed. There's already around 10 people registered for it. So we still have a couple of spaces left. In case you're interested to participate in this virtual course, which will also include the certification, we have made a special promotion for only the people who are participating in the webinar today. So in case you want to get the formal certification, you can use this registration code all the way at the bottom, and that will automatically give you a discount when you register for the course online. So I hope that that is a nice benefit of attending the webinar today, and that it will give you a bit of value for the time that you've chosen to spend with us today, besides, of course, learning more about the cybersecurity framework. Good, so that kind of wraps up our discussion today. I hope you found this webinar interesting and that you now know a little bit more about the requirements, the needs, and the way to structure a cybersecurity framework. And I would now like to take a moment to moderate some of the questions. I've seen some questions coming in during the presentation. So let's have a quick look at the Q&A in order to see what can happen here. Good. We have 2 questions already here, so let me go and answer those right away. The first one, is NIST a framework that will be largely used for the US only? And do you see become more of a global framework, or will be likely like Prince 2 and PMP, which are used in different versions of the world? Well, the reason that we launched these courses in Asia Pac is because what we've seen so far is that NIST is really adopted and embraced by different governments within Asia Pac as well. So it's now being used also by Singapore. We see that it's coming to Malaysia. So I think that this will be a global standard. And the reason why I think that is because it is not just focused towards one particular aspect. It is focused and it's not trying to replace any existing standards. It is there in order to ensure that you can combine different and best practices which are already in place. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of competing standards. The reason that we're covering this topic today and why there's so much interest in it is because I don't think we will look at this from a competing point of view towards the future. Good, couple of other questions is, what is the first step within the framework? So how do you get started? Well, I think the first step with any framework or with any implementation is just to get knowledge. So I already mentioned a couple of times, I would say read up on the standard, make sure that you understand it. All of the materials is available for free on the NIST website. So that's a really useful way to get started. Additionally, if you would like to have a more detailed discussion about the framework itself, then I highly encourage you to go on a more formal certification program where you can take some training in order to do that. Other question that we've received is, how many frameworks are out there and why is NIST the best? Well, let me say first and foremost that I don't necessarily think that NIST is the best, because other frameworks or standards like ISO 27000 are very useful and they are being adopted across the world by organizations, and it's very good guidance. So I don't so much say that the NIST cybersecurity framework is the best. I would, however, say that it's the most complete, because it's taken an approach of referencing on other standards as well. So meaning that you can still use the other standards that are available, and you can use these just the way you've been using them for years. So I think that NIST just adds another dimension or another layer towards that all enterprises can use in order to take the next steps with cybersecurity. And I think that that is really crucial from an implementation point of view, because having sound cybersecurity in place is really crucial to protecting your organization and the assets that you have within your company. And by setting up a framework, you have a vendor independent, professional approach that other companies are also using across the world. And that will make it really useful. So I hope that that answers some of the questions. Good. See one more comment coming in on the chat. Could the framework apply to SME companies within Malaysia? Is a question from Adam. The answer is absolutely yes. So we've done that as well. I'm not able to share the names of the companies for confidentiality reasons, but yes, there are existing SME companies within Malaysia that are using this. The reason for that is that the framework itself you can tailor that. So based on what we've discussed as the core aspects of the framework, you first start with identifying, well, what are the goals and the risk appetite that we have for a specific organization. And of course, for an SME company, that will be completely different than for a large multinational or government. But the fact that you can tailor the framework in such a way that it's applicable for any type of organization is what I think makes the framework really strong. So the answer to your question, Adam, is definitely yes. So I hope that that provides you with some good guidance. Good, I see one more question coming in. So let me take a moment to look at that. Oh, that's just a thank you. So I think those are the questions that have been coming in so far. So other than that, I would like to take a moment to thank everybody for participating in the webinar today. I hope you found this short course or this short overview of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework useful. I would like to thank everyone for submitting all of their questions. It always makes these webinars quite fun to present. And afterwards, you will again receive a short survey and please let us know what you thought about the webinar and which other topics you would like to see covered in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will look forward to seeing you on any of our other upcoming sessions. Bye-bye.